Welcome to the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast, hosted by me, Jen Trechek.
And me, Aileen Rutledge.
This podcast is dedicated to exploring the world of occupational therapy, sharing the latest research and techniques and providing insights into the many ways that occupational therapy can help people of all ages live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Whether you are a practicing occupational therapist, a student of occupational therapy, or simply curious about this fascinating field, this podcast is for you. We'll be interviewing experts in the field, sharing stories from the front lines of occupational therapy practice, and providing tips and advice for anyone looking to get the most out of their therapy.
So sit back, relax, and join us on this exciting journey into the world of occupational therapy in Ireland. Today on the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast, we are joined by Michelle Murray from Anchor Therapy. I think, Michelle, you were the first occupational therapist I was aware of in Ireland that was offering private occupational therapy from a mental health perspective. And Anchor Therapy works with teenagers and young people and adults with mental health challenges and a range of neurodiversity as well. And we are delighted to have you on today to talk a little bit about executive functioning, because you also do a lot of work with ADHD Ireland. So you're very welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
A lot of OTs will be familiar with the term, but just for anybody who isn't, would you tell us a little bit about what is executive functioning, or how you might describe it?
Yeah, so I guess executive functioning is a set of mental skills that help us really live our daily life. So without them, functioning in the world is very difficult. So they exist in an area of the brain at the very front there, the prefrontal cortex. And, they control our ability to, organize ourselves, to be on time, to, filter out distractions, to be able to process information effectively. So, if you think of young people or adults maybe working or in school, to be able to actually sit in a classroom, to be able to come home to your homework, listen to mum or dad, anything like that involves executive functioning.
So really important skills.
Yes, very important. I would say, incredibly essential, and I almost feel like they're not massively spoken about, maybe in schools or colleges or among parents, or even understood very well. But as OTs, and I'm sure you guys see it too, it can be so incredibly debilitating if we don't have good executive functioning skills.
Michelle, how would we go about assessing executive functioning in young adults and teenagers, adolescents?
Yeah. So, how we go about it is almost through kind of an analysis of the day. So, we would ask a lot of questions around from the moment you get up in the morning to how you get to school. Is that tricky, and what parts of that are tricky for you? So we're really trying to figure out the tricky parts of the day, and things that we are alert for are things like, I'm always late, or I never have my books or in my bag, or I always forget my homework, my locker's a mess, I'm always getting in trouble in class for speaking out loud or messing. Like so many of those things. So they're popping up in our head as, okay, well, that's a red flag. There's possible challenges there. And then we may ask a parent as well, if we're working with the teens, around, what do you know? So the parents will often say things like, it's so hard to get out on time. They're not listening to me when I'm chatting about things that they're not interested in. It's very hard for them to get off their phone, for example. Like, that's just so challenging. They get stuck in it. So again, we're alert to this. But we may also assess for, I guess, what I would almost call foundations, but underneath, if you're not sleeping well, your diet may be very poor, you've no exercise, it's very likely executive functioning is tricky too. So as OTs, again, we'd be looking outside of that and figuring out, well, are the foundations in place as well? Is this teenager actually sleeping, or etc.? And is that affecting executive functioning? So it's kind of, there's a lot to it, but through lots and lots of questions, that's how we would do it anyway.
So really looking holistically, even diet, I'm sure, and activity levels.
Yeah, because I think we can forget about that. You could focus in so much on maybe this child doesn't get to school on time, and it might be important to them. But actually, if sleep is really tricky and they're on their phone half the night, and then they're very lethargic, they don't exercise, and they're not eating well, maybe they skip breakfast. It makes sense, doesn't it, right, that we would actually start by maybe focusing on that. and figuring out perhaps maybe it isn't as important to them, but we could try and chat through that and then also figure out the goals that are really important to them so that we can help their executive functioning.
I think I really like the term executive functioning skills, because as a parent, we often look at things as behavior. So if my child is, and I'm guilty of this with mine when they were younger, they're not in the car on time, you're thinking they're just being lazy, or they're being deliberately holding us all up, or, they've forgotten something, they're being careless, they're just not thinking. And we nearly blame the child as if it's a deliberate choice. Whereas when we think about it in terms of executive functioning skills, it's not a choice, it's a skill that they haven't maybe quite developed.
Yeah, it's a lovely, compassionate way of looking at it. And I know what you mean, because as a parent, I mean, you're just so tested when you have to get out the door and get to work. So like, it's just so hard. But like, at least if you can have a little bit more understanding, and particularly if your young person has maybe a diagnosis of ADHD, or perhaps often with autism as well, then we know executive functioning is more challenged and more tricky. So then at least it can allow a window for you to kind of pause and think, okay, well, like, they are not just being difficult right now. Like, this actually is tricky for them. So I agree with you. And I think that's a big part of this whole piece of work as well, actually, is around kind of education for the young person and the parent, around that, like, this is genuinely hard. If, for example, if you have ADHD, it will be harder to get out the door on time or be organized.
So transitions, Michelle, is a key area of your work. What do you do if, as Jen says, that skill isn't there yet, that we need to help develop it, or maybe compensate if the skill isn't there yet? What sort of strategies do you work on with young people?
Yeah, so transitions, you mean like primary, secondary to college?
Maybe even transitions across the day. First of all, those smaller
Yeah.
transitions, and then we can talk about the bigger transitions maybe afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing again as OTs, we're always looking at the environment as well. So we would work closely with schools. So firstly, if the young person and the parent have disclosed a diagnosis to school and we know there's executive functioning difficulties, I would be definitely supporting the family in chatting to school around how can we support the young person better with these transitions. So that might look like, as support person, meeting someone at a locker, helping them pack a bag, and then getting them to class. Now, this is tricky, right, with the piece around getting extra help, because young people don't want that and don't want to be seen as different. But that would be always my first discussion, to say, what would that be like for you to actually have someone help you? And getting, where possible, just helping educate in school around why it's tricky, how real this is for the young person, so that people are looking out for the young person, even if they're not actively supporting them. Um, then I would be, if the young person themselves and now working with the person, I would be helping them maybe with fine tuning their lists. So often we might find a young person would have loads of lists, or it's a bit chaotic. We might, really tease out that system, their organizational system, and try and have one list or something that's stuck on the locker that's, very obvious and clear, maybe color coordinated if that's what they like. So we would probably look at something like that, an organizational tool. Or perhaps in their bag, making that a little bit more organized, where it's labeled, or there's certain compartments for certain things, and we're trying to build consistency with that, and that can help with transitions. I'm thinking kind of more secondary school for this kind of group. With college, then I would say, because there's so many different strategies, but with college, I think because the biggest challenge is the routine is not consistent. And I'm kind of in one day for an hour, in another day for 3 hours, so maybe I just won't bother going in, or that kind of thing. I would be trying to support a young person to build a routine with, having regular habits at times in the day that filter into, then I go to college, this is the time I have to leave at, maybe reminders on my phones, things like that. So we are using different tools like that to help us remember things, whether it's paper or whether it's my phone.
Yeah, so building in that extra layer of structure and visual support, I suppose.
Yeah.
Does it tend to be when people transition or make a change into a new environment, like a new school or moving into college, is that a time where you would see more executive functioning challenges, or the deficits become a little bit more clear?
Yeah, I think so. Like, because I would get a lot of referrals for first years in secondary school. And I think what I'm assuming is the scaffold in primary school is there for a lot of young people. And, you have the same teacher all day, the same peers, smaller classrooms. And then secondary school is just so overwhelming with the changes in the classroom. So the amount of skills you need to just be organized to get to your next class, it's in a different location, you have to navigate loud corridors, like there's so much extra stress really that's placed on a young person, and then we know the stress can affect the skills in themselves. So yes, I would agree with the primary, secondary, and then the secondary to college. Again, as I said there earlier, in college then we lose the structure of a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 3 routine, and that's really chaotic. And you've got all these new peers, you don't really have as much of a deadline. You're kind of expected to go and have autonomy, follow through with these extra readings you have to do. Like all this extra motivation is needed when you may not be motivated, may not be bothered, may not have the ability to prioritize what needs to be done, and that can be very stressful then, I think.
Is there anything we can do for children in primary school, maybe just to better prepare? We know this is a difficult transition, that big leap into post-primary. What can we do for maybe 5th class, 6th class students to prepare for that big change in their lives?
Yeah, so I think like in general, I mean, I quite like being organized, but I think in general, maybe building in an organizational system where, you support a young person to be able to follow visual cues around, this is what I need for the next day, and start to build their autonomy with that. That I put out my uniform the night before, I maybe check what subjects I have the next day, or I check what I might need in terms of extra sports gear. Things like that can be useful to build, and then we'll practice the skill. But I think then for maybe the kids who are neurodivergent, I would be probably advocating to support letting school know, and if we can get supports in place before I enter. So it's not that I'm starting off really struggling and then getting supports in place. If the young person is okay with that, getting supports in place from the start to help with that transition as well. And then maybe even like build a bit of a team. If your young person is struggling, it might be that you kind of team up with another young person who's a pal and say, look, could we meet you outside school at this time, and you guys walk in together, and maybe that person's like a buddy. Because we know, again, with executive functioning, if you can mirror someone when you're doing a task that's tricky for you, I actually find this quite incredible. The mirror neurons in the brain can fire, and your executive functioning will work better. So if you can do a study with someone else, or walk into school with someone else, get your books from your locker with someone else, all of that will be really positive for the young person who's struggling. So if they have a friend that they're going to be with, that can be lovely, and a nice kind of safe way to build that little bit of structure from the start as well, I think.
It's seeing it again, that's that visual demonstration rather than following a verbal list of instructions that sometimes gets confused.
Michelle, we think with executive functioning, I often think about the organization and planning and the management skills, but there's also a big element of emotional impact or management in relation to executive functioning. Could you talk a little bit about how students can be supported to develop their emotional management, or how they can be supported around particularly times of transition in terms of managing that emotional aspect?
Yeah, you're so right. And it's interesting how I haven't even touched on it yet, but it is a huge part. Like this, we might use the term dysregulation, but maybe a lot of the young people we would see in architherapy would describe jumping from like 1 to 100. And particularly it might be in school, like at the end of the day, that term burnout is being used a lot at the moment, but we would be seeing that. So how we would support people to become a bit more in tune, I guess firstly we're trying to start to help them identify, what times of the day are we noticing maybe the battery is becoming depleted, or I am having that jump from 1 to 100. And then we're starting to help them through maybe labeling even of emotions. What is actually going on for you? Is it, it might look like anger from the outside, but what else is actually there? What's under the surface? We might do that through even a visual, like an iceberg or something, where you kind of figure out, under the surface actually is anxiety and exhaustion from the day of trying to perform and keep up with my peers, is probably, I would say, the most common thing we're seeing. But yeah, I think supporting young people, whether it's through visuals, whether it's through, even doing some art in a session together, but supporting them to just start to learn to communicate, actually, that's actually what's going on for me. And I think another big part of the dysregulation is that we want to support people to learn that I don't have to wait till I'm at 100. Like I can tune in regularly throughout the day, even just a moment to check in and notice, where am I at in that battery? Am I heading towards red? Am I becoming depleted? Well, then I need a time out. So it's learning your own, I guess, resources. Do I need to take a time out? does school know I need to take a time out? Or if they don't know, if I don't want them to know, how do I do that myself then? Like, if that's my choice, how can I start to learn to practice maybe breathing or practice doing having a sensory break on my own? What would that look like?
Because that's a big element, isn't it? The embarrassment factor for teenagers of not wanting to take a break because they don't want to appear different to peers or to miss out on learning as well.
Yeah. And it is, yeah,
Is
you're
that
right. It's so tricky because not only appearing different, but as you said, then you do miss out on learning, which is like a cycle then, isn't it? Extra stress then that I actually haven't been at that class. So I just think it's such a tricky area for young people, and like your heart would break when you hear some stories because I'm finding more and more referrals now are talking about the fact that they actually are struggling to just get to school because it's so hard. But it makes sense in a way if the environment is more so supporting a neurotypical brain where someone has this wonderfully functioning executive skills. Yeah, if you're struggling, like school's so hard, college is so hard, and it's not set up for that type of brain.
And that touches on the social aspect. And maybe if we could focus on university students for this, Michelle, for those students that really struggle with the social aspects of, that's all intertwined with executive function and making friends, working as part of a group, they're spending so much time trying to process all of the other and using all those extra scaffolds like around visual supports and time management, etc. There isn't very much capacity left then for the social aspect. How would you support students that are struggling in that area?
Yeah, so like there's a few elements because firstly, executive function could affect your social skills in that, even engaging in conversation and being present can be really tricky if your mind is a mile a minute, and you're getting distracted by other people, especially in college, is so busy and loud. So that could be affecting it. And then you may find some people are just very anxious with all these new people around them. Other people may be completely overloaded sensory wise. And again, maybe, if you have a diagnosis, if you're autistic, that could be extra tricky. Your social skills might be trickier as well. So how we support people, I guess, again, we'd be figuring out a bit of an analysis, but trying to get a sense of, well, what do you want socially, firstly? What's important to you? Maybe what are your interests? And then we would chat about where you might have this kind of a conversation in college. So really get into detail where would be a safe space to practice. For some of our young people, like we might go, we're in town, so we might go out in town and like have a coffee in a coffee shop. Again, that just make do a normal activity together. But a lot of it is around, again, practicing the skills together, analyzing the environment that someone might be doing this in, and trying to nurture their interests. So maybe, setting goals around joining social groups in college, or like, maybe even just sitting beside one person and practicing conversation with that one person in an area of interest. Because I think the social piece is just so important, isn't it, to feeling like you can enjoy college and get through it.
And also accepting that maybe the social bit is difficult, so that it takes so much energy, and the need for alone time and to not have to mask or to not have to pretend or to not have to live up to this expectation is so important for mental health, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially in college when you see like there's everyone's going out and there's all these nights out and there's such pressure then, isn't there, socially? And if you're not someone who actually wants to do that, yeah, you can feel very different then, I guess.
there's I find though a lot of that kind of perception that everybody is having great nights out and doing all these kind of things all the time, and in secondary school as well, that everybody has their group and everybody is socially connected, and I wonder sometimes whether that's the reality or is that the projected reality on social media or other things. Are the expectations maybe a little bit unrealistic?
And then if you think about, I mean, there's sometimes I'm working with a young person and they'll say, I know I'm the only one like this in school. And then in my head, I'm thinking, well, you're not, because I'm working with other people in your year. So you're so right, Jen. Like, sure, it is that. And I wonder, is social media increasing that anxiety and that fear that we're so different, or we should be doing more socially?
And so there's an education piece around that, isn't it? That's so important, around self-acceptance and awareness of what what's important to me, what do I prioritize socially, what is really necessary here, and what would I actually really enjoy. Would I really enjoy that night out, or would I prefer doing
Mm,
something that's more aligned to my interests and strengths?
yeah, what do I need? And it's tricky with like with college students, you're that bit older, so you can make those decisions. I find working with the teens often, because as a parent, you do want your child and your teen to have friends and to fit in. So you might push that, or even in therapy they might say, as an OT, can you work on the social piece? But actually the young person isn't maybe that motivated or bothered with it. So, and that's really tricky then, because if the young person genuinely is quite happy maybe with one friend or no friends, that is their choice too. So it's, yeah, it's trying to figure out, well, is there a social need there that how can we meet that, I guess.
And then that's maybe working more with the parent or the support adults to help them realize that isn't the important bit here, and that's not the priority. And again, trying to educate around enforcing our neurotypical views on the young person.
Yeah, it's complex.
Do you do a lot of work with parents, Michelle, in your practice?
Yeah, I find, because we work with 13 up, like I find with the younger ones, it can be so useful to work with parents, because, and we actually work with some amazing parents who are really help seeking, and I find it actually can be really useful if the young person is happy with that. Then yes, we actually often do involve the parents, and particularly with like home routines to help with getting to school. Often the young person will say, actually, I just want mum to stop nagging me in the morning. So therefore it's so useful to have mum involved. And then if mum is happy to stop, to step back a bit and use different language, or use phones instead, it can be massive then for the young person to have their own autonomy, to be able to get up on their own or something like that. So yes, I would say we've lovely interactions with parents that are really, really helpful. And I often would be, I like working with parents, and I think it's really useful, if we're working with the teens, definitely.
This might be a bit of a blindsider, but just if you had a magic wand, Michelle, and you could wave it, and we could create an education environment that was supportive of executive functioning, developing executive functioning skills for teenagers and for young adults, what would that look like?
Oh, it's so hard, because I feel I'm even locked into, you have to say it. I mean, okay, so I'd be thinking, firstly, I would love if schools could identify a young person's learning style. So if I'm visual, I'm auditory, wouldn't that be wonderful if teachers were really aware of that? So the tools they use to educate incorporated somehow, that someone can learn auditory, someone can learn through watching, someone can learn different ways. That would be useful. I think, I mean, I don't know how this would work, but if we could have more movement, more maybe independence or flexibility to be able to remove ourselves and have a sensory break. Now, if there's a principal listening, they would think I'm mad. How would that work? Because obviously there's curriculum that we have to get through. So it's so tricky. But I think, yeah, and then also, like, I mean, if I'm going to wave the magic wand, I'll wave it. But if there were soundproof locker rooms, because locker rooms just seem to be so difficult for people with, noise sensitivities and things like that. So if we could have space, if we could have maybe bigger lockers with lovely visual cues on the side and organization, little folders, all of those things could make life easier. Um, but I think even if we could start, like some amazing schools I do work with, even just firstly all understanding, the neurodiversity and understanding executive functioning. I mean, that's a great place to start, and actually educating themselves, and working with OTs, and actually taking on, the advice. Like I had a school that they were just so good. Like they set up they had a sensory space, but they printed out the resource that I was using with the young person, had them there in a folder, and someone would come in, an SNA, and spend a bit of time with the young person when she took her sensory break, to go through some strategies like maybe breathing, or squeezing my hands, but just it's just so simple. And it was only a 5-minute job, but it worked and was really transformative for this young person. So even if that was possible, again, that takes money. It makes me sad talking about it, because I feel like I'm, it's such a wand.
Magic wand. It's a nice
Yeah.
idea. And, it's only when we start talking about it and maybe trying to smash through some of those expectations that are there. Why do we have the system that we have?
Yeah.
It's a very archaic education system, and teachers doing an amazing job
Yeah.
in it. But I just think the question why do we have it this way is quite a helpful one.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the lockers as well, and they're all crammed on top of each other and squeezing. The social aspect of it, this tactile aspect of it, it's a sensory nightmare actually, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
The lockers in the corridors, yeah.
And lunchtimes.
Yeah.
So you sound, Michelle, like you are quite an organised OT. You like systems. Is there any kind of top strategies that you use in your practice that you find helpful?
I would probably, when it comes to organisation, I mean, I just use really simple pen and paper list, but I would be really strict on what goes on it. Not too many things, and very much so the priorities of the day. And I do that because I see when I work with a lot of people, you know, you can sometimes use all these amazing apps or tools or like loads of different systems, and it can just get really confusing. So I tend to just focus on one, and for me that's pen and paper. But yeah, so that would be one thing I think is useful. If you can find one system, just cut out the rest and try and just give that one a go and see if you can be consistent even for a few weeks with it. Another thing that for me is useful, I cannot cope with clutter, so I would have to have a clear workspace, and I would always try and support young people, whether we're doing, you know, an online call or whether we're meeting face to face, to set goals around clearing my space if that's the first thing I do of my day. And generally with less stimulation around us, visual stimuli, we're more likely to be able to focus and get things done. So that would be another thing. And then maybe supporting people, again, for myself, if there's any noise I can't concentrate, so I'll use like the sound of rain. So I would try and maybe support people I work with, again, figuring out if there are distractions, can you use maybe headphone noise cancelling, or like rain or radio, whatever it is that works for you. Figure that out as well. They're probably 3 tips.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michelle. Some really top ideas and good insights, you know, particularly I think for parents of children who are struggling with executive dysfunction. It's good to even have the language and the awareness of what that is and how we can support. So really appreciate your time. I know you're coming to us today from Australia, so thank you for taking the time out of your sunshine day over there to talk to us.
No, it's been so lovely. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Michelle. That's all for today's episode on the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it informative and engaging. If you've any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at irishotpodcast@gmail.com or connect on Instagram or Facebook.
And remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve the show, so please do leave it. Thank you for listening to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by myself, Jen Trachak.
And myself, Aileen Rutledge.
We look forward to sharing more insights and knowledge with you in future episodes. Until then, take care.